Yeah, what I mean by cerebellar gross anatomy is way back when somebody pulled the brain from bodies like we did earlier. Yes, Haley?
These screens back here aren't showing what we're seeing. I think you have two versions here.
I have two.
Yes, not showing the same.
The red camera's on.
The red cameras. Oh, this one?
Yeah, this one.
I think that's. This is attached to this thing here. Is this showing something else?
Yeah.
Oh, dot cam. I see. Okay.
Okay, here you go.
Better? Okay, thank you for letting me know. I had no idea. Yeah, there were, one was set to the dot cam. Okay, what I mean by cerebellar gross anatomy is way back when somebody first pulled the cerebellum, pulled somebody's brain from their skull, and they looked at the cerebellum, okay, that piece back here in the back. This is what they named the parts that they saw. Okay, nothing more than that. It's just a labeling thing. We start with, this is going to be my standard sagittal section here through, and this is the brain stem. Okay, and then this is going to be the cerebellum in the back. So what's the uppermost part of the brain stem called? So this is your midbrain. The middle part is going to be your pons, and then this is your medulla, and then this is your cerebellum. Okay, so everybody oriented? We're going to talk about these. We're going to start over here first. We'll talk about these in a minute. Okay. So standard sagittal section. You should know that when you look at the brain stem is in the front, and then the cerebellum is going to be in the back. So since the brain stem is in the front, you can't see this middle section if you look at it from front on. Okay, but there's going to be one middle section that we're going to start with. Just basic gross anatomy. There's going to be one lobe here that you're not going to see it from the front because the brain stem's in the way. Okay. I didn't name it, so this is going to be your flocculo, F-L-O-C-C-U, flocculonodular, N-O-D-U-L-A-R, lobe. So, flocculonodular lobe is going to be tucked in right behind the pons.
You said nodular.
Nodular, yeah, F-L-O-C-C-U-N-O-D-U-L-A-R, flocculonodular lobe. Okay, that's going to be one region of the brain stem that we're going to look at. There's going to be another lobe that's going to be here. Let's divide it. So this uppermost lobe of the brain, and again, just gross anatomy, nothing more. It's going to be your anterior lobe. So what I've shown here in blue is be my anterior lobe. Okay, so floccular nodular lobes in red, anterior lobe shown in blue. It's going to be on top. And on the very bottom, nothing too fancy, there's this other part that's called your posterior lobe. Okay, so looking at it in a sagittal section, you can see this floccular nodular lobe is tucked in behind the brainstem. On top of that, the very topmost portion of the cerebellum, the gross anatomy, is known as the anterior lobe. The bottommost portion is called the posterior lobe. Pretty simple. Now, this is a straight sagittal section. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take away the brainstem. I'm just going to remove it. And I'm going to take the cerebellum and I'm going to flip it up like that. So what you're going to see is the front of the cerebellum. That's going to be this picture here with the brainstem removed. Okay, that makes sense? So this is the cerebellum still. But this is looking at the cerebellum with the brainstem would ordinarily be sitting right here. And I'm just going to represent this from a frontal view. Okay. There are two large white matter conduits here. Okay. These white matter conduits are really important for axonal transmission into the cerebellum from the pons, and we're going to look at them later on. But for now, you need to know that these are your middle cerebellar peduncles. And if you remember, we've been talking about the fact that the word peduncles is just another way to say a white matter. Okay. Now, think about the flocculonodular lobe. Now you're going to be able to see it pretty clearly because the brainstem's not in the way. Okay, ordinarily you wouldn't see it. So your flocculonodular lobe, like I showed before, is going to be here tucked in the middle. Okay. Okay, so you have your middle cerebellar peduncles. And then this is your flocculonodular lobe right here, tucked in the middle. And you can see it because the brainstem's not in the way anymore. Way back when I first started teaching this content, I thought the flocculonodular lobe here really reminded me, it looked like the wings that you get from the airplane when you're a kid. Did you ever see those wings? And then I guess about 5 or 6 years ago now, somebody in the class said that this looked like something else. The whole thing looked like something else. Does it look like anything to anybody out there?
Looks like a frog.
Looks like a mustache.
It's the penguin of Madagascar.
Oh.
There it is. Now you see it, right? So I'll never forget that. It's like, okay. So, but yes, that's I always associate the penguins of Madagascar with the cerebellum. I guess they don't have much balance. Okay. A blast from the past, right? So on top of the flocculonodular lobe, we have this upper lobe here. This is your anterior lobe. Okay, you can see that those white matter conduits going right through there. And again, this is just looking at the gross anatomy. Okay, and then the bottommost portion, pretty simple. It's just going to be your posterior lobe. Okay. There's your posterior lobe. Sometimes in textbooks or other places, you might see this bottom representation, which I'm going to draw here in a minute. And here what they're doing is they're looking at the view of the cerebellum from the back end. Okay, so looking at it from this end. And because when you look at it from this end, you can't see that middle flocculonodular lobe. So they've just taken that lobe and just rolled it right down. So it's represented actually underneath the cerebellum. But this is just the cerebellum from a posterior view. So if I was looking at it from this direction, straight across. Okay. And what you see, so here's your flocculonodular lobe down the bottom. And that's nothing more than just taking it and bringing it down there so you can see it. Okay, and Nothing really surprising. About halfway through, we have separation between the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. I think the textbook that we're using it uses this bottom view. Also going to use it when talking about functional regions of the cerebellum, because that's the side that you see the most often. Questions about that? And this is nothing more than gross anatomy, okay? No function, no nothing. This is just thinking about the cerebellum and what parts you see, okay? Jeff?
You said that was a posterior view?
This is the posterior view. So you take this anterior view and flip it around,
Okay.
but you can't see the floccular nodular, so it's just pulled down to the bottom so you can visualize it. That's all.
Separate.
It's separate, yeah. So I just took it from the inside and just pulled it down so you can see it. Okay, most textbooks are going to use the bottom view, and that's what we're going to use going forward. Any other questions? Okay, like I said, this is just gross anatomy. We're going to now transfer to the next one and look at cerebellar functional regions and nuclei. So two different things here. So again, this is going to be that posterior view of the cerebellum that we just looked at a minute ago. Only now instead of thinking about gross anatomy, we're going to think about function. Because each part of this cerebellum has its own unique function. Okay, it's considered a different region. Over here, we're going to look at the nuclei that are associated with that function, but we're going to start over on this side. Okay. So what's the name of this gross anatomical piece right here? Does anybody remember? Yeah, that's your flocculonodular lobe, correct. Okay, and as far as a function is concerned, I'm going to write that down. As far as a function is concerned, the flocculonodular lobe has a very specific function. It's called a specific part of the cerebellum. It's mostly involved in balance. Okay, and because of that, the flocculonodular lobe as a functional region is known as the vestibulo, V-E-S-T-I-B-U-L-O, cerebellum. And that region in general is involved in balance. Okay, we talked a little bit about the vestibular nucleus, thinking about the vestibulospinal tract earlier. We're going to look at it a little bit more today in the vestibulocerebellar pathway. Got it? Okay, now there's another big region of the cerebellum that you need to be aware of. And if you look from the posterior view, you have two little bumps, one up top and one below. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a dot, and I'm going to create a line between those bumps. It's sort of like a spine here, if you can imagine that. So it's the very center of the cerebellum itself. And that center has a name. It's called the vermis, V-E-R-M-I-S. Okay, the vermis of the cerebellum. Okay. Vermis of the cerebellum is a functional region that's nothing more than just the absolute middle. Okay, right down the middle, it's like the spine of the cerebellum. Okay, as far as a functional region is concerned, the vermis of the cerebellum is going to be responsible for non-conscious proprioception. Very specifically, since it's right in the middle, for the trunk. Okay, trunk muscles, trunk musculature. Okay, so any information transmitted to the vermis of the cerebellum is going to be concerned with the position in three-dimensional space without thinking about it, unconscious, of trunk musculature, okay, where your trunk is in three-dimensional space. Okay, and just to the outside of the vermis, there's going to be another area that kind of goes here. I'll get that here. And this one's bilateral. The vermis, there's just one right down the middle, but these areas are bilateral. And that area is known as the paravermal area. It's paravermal, or just to the outside of the vermis. And it is responsible for non-conscious proprioception of extremities. So it's kind of really important to know where your extremities are in three-dimensional space, and it's so important that your cerebellum has a whole part to figure that out. Okay, everybody got that? So you have trunk and you have extremities. Trunk goes with vermis, extremities goes with paravermis, and both of these regions together are going to use or comprise one major area of the cerebellum, and that is going to be your spine. It's called your spinocerebellar area. There it is. So both of these together, like this is vestibulocerebellum, this is your spinocerebellum. If you remember, that's the spinocerebellum. Does anybody remember those tracts that we talked about in the spinal cord? They're responsible for conveying non-conscious proprioception. Well, that's where they're going to transmit their information to. Under the dorsal and spinal cerebellar tracts. We're going to look at those again today. Yes?
For paravermal, it says non-conscious proprioception, what?
Of the extremities.
Okay.
Yeah, extremities. So upper and lower extremities, both. And the interesting thing about the cerebellum that's very different than the cortical region, if you have a stroke in your cerebellum, it presents ipsilaterally. That means on the same side. So if the right side of the cerebellum is affected, your right arm's not going to have a whole lot of control. You're going to be ataxic on your right side. Okay? So ipsilateral presentation. We'll look at the pathways today to see how that happens. And then finally, the last one that we're going to talk about here is this lateralmost region. Okay, this lateralmost region, simply enough, is known. These are known as the lateral hemispheres. And again, these are bilateral. Lateral hemispheres, as far as a functional part, are known as the cerebrocerebellum. When you think about the word cerebro, what does it bring to mind?
X-Men. X-Men.
X-Men? Cerebro? No, not for me. Sorry. What is cerebro? Anybody? Yeah, thinking. Right? And that's exactly their job. The cerebellum is going to be involved with thinking about moving. And we're going to look at that, and that's actually going to be one of the parts that is involved with coordination of complex movements. Just put that down. Coordination of complex movements. Okay, questions about that? Makes sense? So 3 different parts. Flacculonodular lobe, also known as vestibular cerebellum, is involved in balance, main function of the cerebellum. Another function of the cerebellum is going to be knowing where your joints and trunk are in three-dimensional space. That information is relayed to the spinocerebellum via the dorsal-spinal-cerebellar tracts. And then finally, we have the lateral hemisphere's functional region known as the cerebrocerebellum. And that is going to be involved in thinking about movement, or like motor planning, or coordinating complex tasks. Yes?
So what is, it says coordination of what? You're thinking of movement?
Complex movements, MVMTS.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, you're coordinating complex movements, yes.
And that part is still unconscious?
No, that's going to be the cerebrocerebellum. We'll get there, but no, that's not unconscious at all. Non-conscious, nope. It's not. So it's not relaying proprioception. The only thing that's non-conscious is the proprioception. This is involved in motor planning. Motor planning. So thinking about, shooting your first free throw, complex movements all across your body. That's where that comes in. And we'll talk about how that comes to play. Any other questions? Okay, so these are all the functional regions on this side. Over here, let's look at the nuclei that are associated with these functional regions. Like I did before, I'm just going to separate out. So this is your vermal region, or your vermis. I'm going to delineate that. Okay, and then looking at the next area over, this is going to be your paravermal area. And on the bottom, we have the flacculonodular lobe. Okay, so this is vermis. Paravermal. And then lateral hemisphere. There it is. I'll just go ahead and label that that way since we're here. Okay. Now, each of the functional regions of the cerebellum has its own nucleus that it uses. Okay, the nucleus these nuclei are also known as deep cerebellar nuclei. Okay, just another word. It means nothing more than the nuclei that are involved with that particular functional region, and they're paired. Okay, they're bilateral. The first region that we're going to look at is look at the vermis and the flacculonodular lobe share a nucleus. Okay, I'm going to put that here in red. Okay, so these are the pair of nuclei that are used by both the vermis and the flacculonodular lobe. And I'll represent that here. So since the flacculonodular lobe is out of there, I'm going to bring it up here. Okay, so they both use this nucleus. The name of this nucleus, put it over here, this is your vestigial. Fastigial nucleus. Okay, your vestigial nucleus is used by anything in the vermis, so any kind of non-conscious proprioception coming from trunk. It's also used by the flacculonodular lobe, so it's involved with balance. Okay, and you can see that vestigial nucleus actually resides in the vermis, so that makes sense. Yes? Yeah, sure. There you go. Okay. So, vestigial nucleus shared by the vermis and the flacculonodular lobe. The next set of nuclei, take the blue, used by this paravermal area. It's actually a pair of nuclei here, but we're going to call them by one name. Okay, they kind of look like that. Okay, paranuclei. These are known as your interposed nuclei. Okay, your interposed nuclei are going to be specific for receiving information from your paravermal region. So think receiving information about non-conscious proprioception from your extremities. Okay, and then the last set of nuclei, again bilateral, this is going to be associated with your lateral hemispheres or your cerebrocerebellum. And to me, they look like a set of teeth, like a half a set of teeth, kind of like that. Or dentures, whatever you want to say, kind of like that. Okay, and they're actually called dentate nucleus, dentate nuclei. It's your dentate nucleus. And when we go back to the lab and look at some slices of the brain, we're actually going to be able to see these are gray matter nuclei. You're going to be able to see this dentate shape in the cerebellum itself. I think it's kind of cool. It's my favorite. Questions? Vermis and floccular nodular lobe go with vestigial nucleus. Paravermal region goes with interposed nucleus. And the cerebrocerebellar region goes with dentate nucleus. Marissa, do you have a question? What is what? What does it say? Oh, floccular nodular lobe. So both the floccular nodular lobe and the vermis use that vestigial nucleus. Spencer.
The dentate
Yes.
has like the same thing as other nuclei where it's related to all the laterals.
Only the lateral hemispheres. It is responsible for receiving all the information coming into the lateral hemispheres, and then the nuclei are going to send out the efferent information to the rest of the brain. We'll see. We'll get to the pathways. So each nucleus is specific for a specific functional region in the cerebellum. Questions? More questions? Hope it makes sense. Okay, now moving on. Cerebellum, there's a lot of words that are different, right? And there's no difference in the rest of neuroscience. But, so yeah, this should say fibers and Purkinje Purkinje cells. I just changed that to okay. This is going to be just fibers and Purkinje cells. Okay, so looking at this is just going to be my normal, looking at the side, maybe a little bit of a sagittal section here. There's some parts that we know. This is the uppermost portion of the brainstem. It's the midbrain. Okay, the middlemost portion is the pons. Lowermost portion is the medulla. Here's your cerebellum. Okay, so kind of similar to what we've seen earlier. Just a few extra things. Probably the biggest thing are these conduits. Now, this one's going to be what was the eyes for the penguin of Madagascar. So this is going to be your middle cerebellar peduncle. Okay, middle cerebellar peduncle, your brain should think pons. It's right smack in the middle of the pons, big old thing. It's nothing more than a white matter conduit between the pons, between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So this is the middle. This guy down here is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, any guesses to the top one for the name? Superior, that's it. This is your superior cerebellar peduncle. And majority of afferent information coming into the cerebellum is going to come in through your inferior cerebellar peduncle to the paravermal and vermal areas. you're going to see that the cerebrocerebellar information coming down from the brain goes in through your middle cerebellar peduncle, and then superior with the ventral spinocerebellar tract comes in and goes back around. So we'll get to that in a minute. But 3 different ways that things can get in. Thinking about something we just talked about when we think about deep cerebellar nuclei, we had vestigial, interposed, and dentate, those 3. And I'm just going to say this is just a generic. This could stand for any of them. Right now I'm just going to draw a nice little circle here. And this is going to represent any of the deep cerebellar nuclei. So this is intended to be a generic labeling. So some words that you need to know. So this is any of the deep cerebellar nuclei, whether it's vestigial, interposed, or dentate. Okay, another new word. It says Purkinje cell. Purkinje cells are associated with each of the different functional regions. Okay, they have a specific shape. They kind of look. The top looks like an onion almost. So it's like that. And every Purkinje cell in a particular region is associated or synapses with its particular deep cerebellar nucleus. So if there's a Purkinje cell in the flocculonodular lobe or nucleus, its functional region, the vestibular cerebellum, that's going to synapse with your vestigial nucleus. Purkinje cell in the paravermal region, synapse with interposed nucleus. Purkinje cell in the cerebrocerebellar region is going to synapse with the dentate nucleus. So each of them, no matter where it is, it's going to synapse only with your deep cerebellar nucleus. Now there's more. There are other things that are coming in that I talked about. Oh, there's this guy here too. We talked a little bit about, this would be the first bump in the medulla where the corticospinal tract decussated. Does anybody remember the name of that first bump? Yeah, that's your pyramid. That's your medullary pyramids. Okay. Now right behind the pyramid there was something, the second bump. Does anybody remember the name of the second bump? Yeah, it's an olive. That's like martinis. Okay. So the olive is so named because it's got this great big old nucleus sitting in the middle of it. Okay. And it's the really important nucleus that we have to learn about. Okay. It is called the inferior olivary nucleus. So this guy right here. The olive sticks out because the inferior olivary nucleus is so big. Okay, the inferior olivary, yes, Sam.
Oh, sorry, I heard
That's
you
fine.
mention the Purkinje cell, but I didn't see where you labeled it, so I was just curious where is that the...
I can label it, yeah, it's the onion looking thing there.
Oh, it's the gray one.
So this
Okay.
is the Purkinje cell.
Okay, that's fine.
Any other questions? I'm just labeling all the players to start with before we do anything serious, making sure that all the pieces are there. Is everything else okay? All right. Now, the inferior olivary nucleus is going to be really important for motor learning. And we'll see that in a minute. There are other fibers coming in, and we talked about the, let's say these are just general fibers. Okay, don't worry about the specific pathway yet, but there's going to be a set of fibers coming from the spinal cord that comes in through the inferior cerebellar nucleus, or goes around the olive and then comes in through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and it is going to make specific contact with its Purkinje cell. Okay. And there's going to be other fibers coming in, and all these orange are just different fibers coming in that's going to come in, and come in here through the superior cerebellar peduncle, and it's going to make contact with its Purkinje cell. And then there's going to be fibers coming down from the cerebrum. It's going to come in here through the middle cerebellar peduncle and make contact with its Purkinje cell. Kind of the main point is that all these fibers that are coming in, no matter which peduncle they're coming in, they're just generic efferent fibers coming into the system. So the generic efferent fibers coming into the system have a special name, and they're called Mossy, M-O-S-S-Y fibers. And Mossy fibers represent generic, no, sorry, they're not efferent, they're afferent information. So stuff coming into the system, generic afferent fibers sending information into the cerebellum. So just your basic information coming into the system, they're all considered Mossy fibers because they're just, that's, somebody named them Mossy fibers, I don't know why. So just delivering basic information into the system. Okay, the majority of information coming into the cerebellum are considered Mossy fibers. There's only one more kind of fiber that you need to be aware of, and that is fibers coming in that are coming from the inferior olivary nucleus. Fibers coming from the inferior olivary nucleus come in the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and they come up here and they make contact with the Purkinje cell. And in addition to making contact with the Purkinje cell, these kinds of fibers coming from the inferior olivary nucleus also make contact with the deep cerebellar nucleus. These kinds of fibers that are specific for coming from the inferior olivary nucleus are called climbing, C-L-I-M-B-I-N-G fibers. Okay, that's your climbing fiber. Kind of the point of this is all the information coming in to the cerebellum from the outside, coming in through Mossy fibers, as well as there's contact being made from the inferior cerebellar nucleus to the Purkinje cell also. This Purkinje cell is aware of all the information coming in. Okay, Alex, did you have a question?
Yeah, so you said that like deep cerebellar nuclei, labeled this like the generic one. How many of them are there? Like Purkinje cells?
Okay. As far as deep cerebellar nuclei, there are 2 fastigial, 2 interposed, and 2 dentate. As far as Purkinje cell, millions, absolute millions. Yeah, it's just what, and we'll get more into that here in a minute, but it's just a whole bunch. Yes. Yes, question.
Are the fibers coming in from the very bottom, are those also Mossy fibers?
Yes. Everything is a Mossy fiber unless it's coming from the inferior olivary nucleus. Everything is considered a Mossy fiber. I don't know who named these things, but you're supposed to know. There's even more, but this is the most important thing that you guys need to know. Any other questions? Yeah, Mackie?
The climbing fibers also carry inherent.
I'm not, the question, I'm about to talk about that, but Alex raised his hand. I think that's a great question. Okay, so Mackie's question was, do Mossy fibers coming in, did the climbing fibers coming from the inferior olivary nucleus also carry afferent information? And the answer is no. Their job is to learn all these other Mossy fibers coming in have delivered their information to Purkinje cell. Purkinje cell is going to transmit that information to the deep cerebellum nucleus. It's then going to put out some information to the rest of the brain. We'll see that in a minute. But what the inferior olivary nucleus, these climbing fibers, they detect all this information. So they know what information was put into the system. It's the job of the deep cerebellar nucleus to make sense of this information and then put out the appropriate output. So the olivary nucleus, it not only knows what was into the system, it also knows what the deep cerebellar nucleus decided to do with it. Okay? And that's where the motor learning comes in. So if you were successful at achieving the task, the inferior olivary nucleus knows what went in, it knows what it decided to do, and that was a good thing. But if the task wasn't successful, then the inferior olivary nucleus says, okay, this is the information that went in, now we need to modulate what goes out. Does that make sense? That's why the inferior olivary nucleus is so important in motor learning. Okay, so it senses all the information that goes into the system by making contact with the thousands of Purkinje cells that are all throughout the cerebellum, as well as each individual deep cerebellar nucleus associated with those fibers. And it can tell whether it was good or not good. Yes, Ben?
So does that make them afferent fibers?
That-
Sending information from the Purkinje cell to the inferior olivary nucleus?
So so they're not, these are just considered climbing fibers. The afferent information is going to be what's coming out of the system. And the afferent information comes from your deep cerebellar nucleus through your superior cerebellar peduncle. And it can go up or it can go down. We'll see that in a minute. All right, so that's going to be your efferent information coming out of the system. So the blue here is efferent. But essentially, they just send out axons that are, each individual pathway has its own place it's going to go. You'll see those here and then a couple of different pathways to look at. Yes?
And so I guess going back to the example of trying to shoot a basketball, is this also taking in, or just kind of clocking the visual information with like hand-eye coordination stuff, or just the physical movement of the extremities?
Just the physical movement. Yeah, the cerebellum is involved in that. Coordination has a little bit of muscle tone involved too, so we'll get to that. We're not there yet. Okay, but the visuals coming from something else. That's going to be the posterior parietal association cortex is going to take care of that. Okay, but this is just movement, kinesthetic movement. So if you guys, next spring you're going to have motor learning with Dr. Raddick. He's going to come back this spring. Yeah, this coming spring. Okay, this is all going to come back. Okay, he's going to talk a little bit about different kinds of learning and what's used. And the cerebellum is really important for something called procedural learning. Has anybody ever heard the word procedural learning? It's learning a motor task without using your brain. There's two different kinds of learning. There's declarative learning and procedural learning. Procedural is like learning to walk. The cerebellum stores that motor program, and then you can walk. When you first start to learn to walk when you're a baby, you're really struggling. Now you can walk and chew gum and play on your cell phone at the same time, right? That's because you have a good cerebellum. Okay, somebody without a good cerebellum is going to have trouble doing that. So it's a program that's stored, and that's where it's stored. Any other questions? Yes, Sam?
I'm sorry, could you just one more time say with the climbing fibers, they're learning information from the deep cerebellar?
So the climbing fibers send out so the inferior olivary nucleus sends out axons. They're called climbing fibers in general. Some of those axons are going to each individual Purkinje cell. Okay? And look at what's coming into each individual Purkinje cell. It's all the afferent information that it's receiving about non-conscious proprioception or thinking about moving. All that information is being put in here. Now, the Purkinje cell is just hooked up to the deep cerebellar nucleus. It doesn't make any decisions. It's a big receiver of all the information, and then it transmits that information to the deep cerebellar nucleus. Okay? The deep cerebellar nucleus then decides how to act based on all this information. Okay? And then, so what happens is the inferior olivary nucleus then has access to all the information about what happened during the motion, and then so where things started. So for example, if I take my hands are in my pocket, and I want to put my hand on my left shoulder, okay, that's going to be very different than if my hand started out on top of my head and then I put it on my left shoulder. So in order for me to move to touch my head, all the information about where my hand started is in here. okay? But if I want to go and touch my head accurately, or like finger to nose or something like that, then I've got to know where my arm is in three-dimensional space without visual input, right? That's usually what happens. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's kind of like, probably the best example I like to give, hate to pick on you, so could you close your eyes and touch your nose? Okay, it's fairly accurate, not bad. Now keep your eyes.
What do you mean fairly?
Now I want you to close your eyes again. Now touch my nose. See, he has no idea, right? He has no idea where I am. But he can do it because his cerebellum knows where he is in three-dimensional space, because his Purkinje cells have stored that information. Does that make more sense as far as how this system works? You know, if his eyes are closed, then he might have a chance of touching my nose, right? But not with his eyes closed. But with his eyes closed, he can do a lot of things and mimic arm positions and that sort of thing. Okay? All right, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break.